wasn't even involved in the war. What caused the Great War? Well, a couple things. European colonialism. Remember how I've talked about colonialism during the Spanish-American War? Well, the Europeans did it a lot more than we did. Industrialism. I've been talking about it for the last several weeks, last week in particular. Steel was introduced, cars, airplanes, radios, all this new technology. Well, now this technology is going to be used for war. The Franco-Prussian War. This was a conflict that happened between Germany and France. And what happened with it is the Germans won that war. As a result, the Germans took part of France, part of their land, Alsace-Lorraine region. And they kept it, and they said, now this is part of Germany. Well, France was really upset over that, and they wanted that land back. So they were just waiting to get into a fight with Germany again. Secret alliances. Well, due to all the fighting, especially going all the way back to Napoleon, countries started forming alliances. The biggest ones were the Triple Entente, which was an alliance between France, Great Britain, and Russia. They knew that Germany was a big country with a lot of people, and Germany and Russia were scared of each other. Well, France made a deal with Russia and said, hey, if Germany goes to war with you, we'll jump in and help you. Well, if we jump in and help you, then that means Germany's going to have to fight a two-front war. They're going to have to fight on the west and on the east against both the French and the Russians. Again, like I said with the little example we did, Britain had an alliance with Belgium. Belgium was threatened, so Britain jumped in to help Belgium. There was also a lot of national pride. People were really proud of their countries. Kind of like we are, yo, go USA. Well, if you were British, you'd be saying, go Britain. If you were German, say, Germany's the best. French, vive la France. There was also a lot of bitter competitiveness between the royal families and an arms race. Each country wanted to have a bigger and better army, bigger, better navy, bigger, better weapons. All this was just combining, and everybody was just waiting to go to war. But what started it was the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. He was the heir to the king. He was next in line to be the king of the Empire of Austria-Hungary. Now, he had a bunch of land, and part of that land was in the Balkans and Bosnia. And he went to Bosnia, and he went to the town of Sarajevo, and he wanted to see how the land was. Well, Bosnia didn't want to be part of Austria-Hungary. They wanted to be part of Serbia, a different country. So there was a little bit of a civil war going on there to begin with. And when the leader came, some of the Serbians said, well, this is our chance. If we kill the prince, the guy that's going to become king, then maybe they'll give us Bosnia and let Bosnia become part of Serbia. Well, this was a really, really bad idea. Again, going back to those secret alliances. Austria-Hungary was friends with Germany. Serbia was friends with Russia. So when the Archduke was killed, Austria-Hungary first said they're going to war with Serbia. Well, Austria-Hungary is a big country. Serbia is a little country. So Serbia goes over to their friend Russia and said, hey, Russia, will you help us out if Austria-Hungary fights us? Russia's like, yeah. Austria-Hungary is afraid of Russia. They're a bigger country. So they go over to their buddy Germany. Hey, Germany, if Russia gets involved to help with the Serbians, will you help us? Germany's like, yeah. Germany starts talking to Russia saying, we're not really going to go to war, are we? Russia's like, no. Russia started moving troops to go help Serbia. Germany got scared. Well, Russia, you said you're not going to go to war, but you're moving troops. So I'm going to go ahead and go to war with you. Germany declared war on Russia first. Immediately after declaring war on Russia, Germany knew that France was Russia's ally. So they declared war on France right away. When they declared war on France, all of a sudden you now have a two-front war. Kind of show you on the map here. Here's Russia, here's Austria-Hungary, Germany, France. Well, Germans, they weren't really scared of France or anything. They had other plans. You know, I'm going to get to that a little bit more. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. When the war really broke out and got full swung, this is why they call it a world war. 28 different countries end up getting involved in the war. 24 of them on the Allied side. 4 of them on the Central Powers. Central Powers are kind of the bad guys, if you want to say. I don't like to use that term really, but for you guys to understand. Now, for the majority of the class, I'm going to be talking about the fighting on the Western Front, because that's where a lot of the really bad fighting happened. But I want you guys to know, fighting happened all over the world. It happened in the Middle East, happened in Africa, happened in Asia, the Pacific, mountains of Italy, Eastern Europe, and like I said, the Western Front. Now the plan that I was telling you guys about that you guys reenacted, this is what they call it the Schlieffen Plan. Again, Germany wasn't afraid of France. They were worried about Russia. So their plan was to go and fight France, beat France real quick, and then go and fight Russia before Russia can get all their troops ready to fight. To do this, the Germans had to come out of Germany and go through Belgium and swing around and come down behind Paris right over here, instead of crossing straight into France. Well, the French, they had their own plan. They called Plan 17, which was to launch their own attack against Germany in the south. Well, because of that, the Germans had to send troops to help, which kept them from going around. Plus, going through Belgium pulled Great Britain into the war. And it just turned into this little fight that nobody can get around anyone else. So, as I had you guys do with the reenacting there, it developed what we call the race to the sea. Everybody was trying to get around each other. Nobody could do it, so it ended up everybody digging in. If I can't get around you, I'm going to make sure you can't get around me. So people start digging in. This is what led to the trenches. The trenches led from the North Sea. I'm going to go back to the map here. Led from the North Sea all the way down to Switzerland. It was almost 500 miles of trenches. Now, the trenches themselves were very complicated, and I'm going to explain a little bit. This is a diagram here showing the basic design of a trench. You had what they call duck boards so the soldier could walk on them and keep their feet dry. Those didn't start out there, you know. At first, when they start digging the trenches, it was nothing but dirt. Well, dirt turns into mud, so people started getting their feet wet. Due to their feet getting wet, they'd start getting diseases like trench foot. So they wanted to keep their feet dry. They would dig a little step in the side of the trench they called a firing step. When a man stood in here, he's well protected. But if he wants to shoot at the enemy, he has to step on the firing step so he can look over. All that dirt that they dug out, they'd use to fill sandbags. And they'd throw the sandbags on the sides. They'd call them the parapet and the parados. The ideal is artillery fire, when they blow up, it's sending shrapnel everywhere. And you want it some way to keep that shrapnel from getting into the trench. Well, one thing that they have to do with the trenches to keep people from getting to them is they'd throw up barbed wire. Large amounts of barbed wire to keep people from coming to them. Pretty soon, you start having these big rows of trenches. You can see in the picture here, this is a map from the air of what the trenches look like. These are all the trenches. The dark shaded areas, it's kind of hard unless you're looking up close. Those are actually shadows of barbed wire. You can see all these little dots and specks. Those are shell craters from artillery. Now I want you guys to notice something. See how the trenches, they aren't exactly straight. They kind of zigzag. The reason why is if an artillery shell hit a trench directly and blew up and it was straight, the shrapnel would go down it in both directions, killing everybody in it. So they'd make these trenches zigzag, so if a shell hit, it'd only blow up a section of the trench, and everybody else around it, around those corners and bends, wouldn't get hit and wouldn't get killed. Now, this whole war was unlike anything that's ever been seen before. It was a whole new war. I've been telling you guys as we've been going up to this class, like during the Spanish-American War, I've talked to you guys about the rifles, improved rifles. Well, they've been improved again. Now they're to the point that they are extremely accurate at extremely long distances. Some of the best shots have been known to make about 2,000, 2,500 yards. They shoot modern day ammunition, the same kind of stuff that we use today. They have machine guns, a lot different. I told you during Cuba, during the Spanish-American War, machine guns were used for the first time. Those machine guns were usually Gatling guns and a couple of more modern, they called them potato digger guns. I could tell you a lot more about them later. But now they have Maxim machine guns. If you guys want to know what a Maxim machine gun is, we have one sitting right over here. It is a water-cooled gun. The bullets it shoots are the same kind of bullets that are used in rifles. So they can shoot the same distances as a rifle. They shoot at high rates of fire, about 500 bullets a minute. Well, people have never been used to this. Kind of like I was telling you about in the Spanish-American War. When they fought, especially at the beginning of the war, they would fight lined up, men next to men next to men. Kind of thinking how these chairs are lined up. Well, now you have one guy with a machine gun. They could just blow over and shoot every one of those guys in just a few seconds. So this caused mass casualties. Another thing that wasn't new was artillery. Artillery has always been used in war, but the technology has changed. One of the more particular pieces was what was called the French 75 cannon. It was the first cannon to use a hydraulic piston system. What would happen is old cannons, like what they used in the Civil War and the Spanish-American War, they would have to roll the cannon up into position, which they would call putting it in battery. They would aim, then they would fire. Well, when they fire, there's recoil, which would pull the gun out of position. So they'd have to re-put it back in battery, re-aim, fire it again. Well, this new cannon, the French 75, with that hydraulic system, they'd put the gun in position, they would fire it, the recoil would move the barrel along a cylinder, and the gun would stay in position. So they wouldn't have to re-aim it or anything like that. It's ready to go. Just reload it and fire it again. So they could fire quicker and quicker and quicker. Well, a couple things that came out. Steel helmets. Everything flying in the air. Bullets, debris, rocks, dirt flying up from artillery shell explosions. Pieces of flying metal from artillery. People were getting hurt in the head. So they start wearing steel helmets. Had poison gas, I'm going to talk a lot about. Had tanks, airplanes, new battleships, modern day battleships. Like I said, it's a whole new war. These are a couple different kinds of machine guns I've already told you a little bit about. You know, they shot the same bullets as rifles. They could shoot about 500 bullets a minute. They could be used for both offensive and defensive actions. Offense is where you're attacking, defense is where you're trying to keep them from being attacked. Most of these guns are very big and heavy. Again, look at the one back there and you can see. Would you like to have to carry that around on a battlefield? No. Those guns weren't used by one person alone. It took a crew to operate those guns, usually about 3 or 4 men. But now you can take 3 or 4 men and shoot a machine gun and kill hundreds of riflemen. Due to the trenches, you start using hand grenades, mortars, howitzers, different kinds of artillery. The idea is how to get the explosion into the enemy's trench. This is why hand grenades were real popular. You could pull the pin on a hand grenade and throw it like a baseball, and it would fall into the enemy trench and blow up. I've got, there we go, a couple pictures of different kinds of hand grenades that were used by the Americans alone. These are fragmentation grenades. What that means is when they blow up into a bunch of little metal pieces that go flying around. And think of it, instead of being shot by one bullet, you have an explosion that's throwing hundreds of bullets at you. These last two over here, these are actually gas grenades. That way I could throw a grenade, it'd blow up and come out in a smoke of gas. They also used smoke to help hide movements. Artillery, here's the 3 different kinds. You have a field gun, a howitzer, and a mortar. The idea is the trajectory. Field gun can be put way back in the distance, and it's shot pretty much straight. Well, shooting straight like that, you can't hit someone hiding inside a trench down here. So they start getting howitzers. Howitzers can shoot at a higher angle and drop down. They would usually have the really, really big guns as howitzers. And to give you an idea how big these are, I'm going to show you in a minute. There was a gun called the Paris gun. The artillery shell it fired is about the size of a Volkswagen Beetle. And it could shoot about 80 miles. You had mortars. Mortars were smaller, but they shot a higher angle yet. And see how it could drop right into the trench. Now, I'm sorry if this is a little graphic for you guys, but I kind of want to show you. This is the idea of these explosions, these guns. This is a shrapnel shell right here. This is a picture of an actual one, broken down. You see there's a bunch of little balls inside it. Those are shrapnel shells.
Don't those things, when they hit, they blow up into little beads?
Well, that's exactly what they are. Those are the little beads right there. When they blow up, they throw out everywhere. It's kind of like a giant oversized piece of buckshot for a shotgun. So when they blow up, like I said, instead of having one bullet flying at you, you now have hundreds of bullets flying at you. Now, to show you something, and this is the one that's kind of graphic. This is a picture of a person's leg getting shot by a bullet. When the bullet goes in through, it's just a clean cut, and it'll come out a little bit bigger. Well, now you have pieces of shrapnel flying, big chunks, bigger bullets. They break bones. So you have people who were injured by being maimed, really hurt and disfigured. I have a piece right over here. This is molten metal. This is a piece of shrapnel. This thing's kind of heavy too. I'd say it weighs probably about half a pound. Can you imagine this thing flying at you so fast you don't even see it coming? And then plus it's burning hot. So when this thing hits you, this thing's going to kill you. This is the Paris gun I was telling you guys about. This was a gun that the Germans had. They used late in the war. It was so big they had to mount it on a railroad train. it would fire a shell, like I said, about the size of a Volkswagen Beetle. And what it would do, it would shoot it about 80 miles into the air, into the space, and then it would fall down. And actually, I've got this backwards. There's the gun, firing it this way. And it'd fall down onto the city of Paris itself. Well, the distance between the gun and Paris was about 40 miles. Give you an idea, that's about being in Cincinnati and firing a Volkswagen Beetle up into the space and hitting downtown Dayton. Okay, well, this is probably the most famous thing everybody thinks about with World War I next to the trenches. Gas. There were all kinds of different poisonous gases. Well, I'll tell you a couple of little stories about gas. The war broke out, people started digging in. Well, when they start getting in trenches and got protection, so they didn't get shot by the machine guns or shot by the rifles, or got killed by the artillery or the grenades, nobody could get these guys out of the trenches. So they start using poison gas. Gas is heavier than air. So when they release it, it would sink down into the trenches, and a soldier would have two choices: stay in the trench and breathe the gas and die, or come up out of the trench and get away from it and be exposed out in the open where they can get shot. Now, the first use of gas was actually tear gas. Tear gas was used against the Russians by the Germans. The French also used tear gas against the Germans. It wasn't very effective. And tear gas isn't poisonous. It just burned your eyes. It made it hard for you to see. So if you're shooting a rifle, you can't really aim because your eyes are all watery. Well, the Germans decided to up the ante. They used, for the first time on April 22nd, 1915, during the Second Battle of Ypres, chlorine gas. Chlorine gas, just like it sounds, it comes from chlorine, the same chemical you put in your swimming pools. You can smell it and you know it when you smell it. What it would do is it would burn your eyes and burn your lungs. When you breathed it, this got really bad, really nasty. It would mix with the natural moisture in your lungs, and it would form hydrochloric acid, which would burn and dissolve your lung tissues. So people would start coughing and throwing up, and when they'd throw up, they would literally be throwing up chunks of their lungs. This would kill you. The problem is, gas isn't very reliable. You would let gas go out, and the wind would blow, and it'd blow right back at you. So they had to find new and more ingenious ways of using gas. A couple different ones they used. Like I said, you had tear gas, you had chlorine, phosgene was the next one, and then mustard gas. Now phosgene, they would often mix it with the chlorine gas. Again, it was heavier than air, and it would sink down into the trenches. Chlorine, you could smell it. Phosgene, it was harder to smell, harder to detect. What phosgene would do is it would displace oxygen, so when you breathe it, it would literally be replacing the oxygen in your lungs, and you would be choking and drowning. You couldn't breathe. It'd feel like a ton of weight on your chest. The really bad thing about phosgene, though, is it didn't work immediately. It would last 2 or 3 days before it would hurt you. So if you breathed it, you may not have known it, and then all of a sudden, 2 or 3 days later, you're hurt. So they moved to mustard gas. Mustard gas is a blistering agent. What it would do is it would burn you, literally. You didn't have to breathe mustard gas to have it affect you. It would form giant blisters on your skin that would burn and hurt. And the other thing about mustard gas is it didn't have to stay in the form of gas. It would turn into liquid, and it would contaminate the soil. So if you're in the trenches and you're moving and you get into an area contaminated with mustard gas and you got a little dirt on you or mud, which happened all the time, this stuff would hurt you and affect you. Now, I think it's kind of important to tell you, with all the gas, only about 2% of all the casualties of World War I was attributed to poison gas. Poison gas worked better in two ways. It was a psychological weapon. It scared people. People didn't want to be messed with it. The other thing is, it was an area denial weapon. If you contaminated an area with poison gas, and you knew that that area had poison gas in it, it'd keep you from going over towards it. So, what better way to keep you from getting around me than to put poison gas over here and poison gas over there? Now, gas, a couple ways that they got it out. You know, I showed you the pictures of the grenades. That was one way. What they did the very first time is they put up giant gas cylinders with pipes and opened the valve and let the wind blow it over. They later developed new technology. They would put tubes in the ground and put bombs in the tubes filled with gas that the bomb could shoot out and then it would blow up. This is a picture of the guys loading the bombs in the tubes. Well, that wasn't always effective too, because think about this. If I had to put a bomb in a tube, I had to come out and stand up where they could shoot me. So what they did is they started developing artillery shells that had liquid gas in them, like these. So they could fire those in the artillery pieces, like the mortars or the howitzers, well behind the enemy lines where you can't see the guns, and fire it, and it'd blow up, and then the gas would fall into the trenches. Now I don't have to worry about the gas blowing back over here. Again, think of like the Paris gun. I load up a gas shell in the Paris gun and I'm in Cincinnati and I fire it, it blows up in Dayton. Dayton's pretty far away for that gas to get me in Cincinnati. This is a real famous picture with the gas wounded. A lot of the times what it did is it would blind you, it would burn you. People didn't know how to treat gas victims. And this picture, what it is the guys have got bandages over their eyes. They're putting their hand on each other's shoulders, walking back to the hospital. Something else that came out in this war was underground mining. Again, here's a couple pictures. Here's the German trenches. The Germans are shooting at the British over here. This is what they call no man's land. Well, you know, if you're out here in the middle of no man's land, you're in the middle of the open, and you can get shot. So they would start digging tunnels underneath the trenches towards each other. And if they could figure out how far they were, get underneath the position, they'd plant bombs under there. And then they'd blow them up. So the bombs would blow up upwards, killing the Germans. The Germans did the same thing. The Germans actually would dig back and they'd be looking for the British underground. So you had a lot of fighting that actually happened underground. I'm going to talk in particular about a certain battle in a minute that the underground mining happened. Flamethrowers was another new weapon. Now, flamethrowers have been used in war all the way back to the ancient Greeks, but nobody really knows how to utilize it. Again, the Germans were the first to use it during the Battle of Verdun, and what they would do, you didn't have to worry about the fire. The fire would suck oxygen out of those underground caves and tunnels and the trenches, and you would die from not being able to breathe, or you would die because you're breathing smoke, or the hot flames. Now, some of the tactics changed late in the war. Like I told you, at the beginning of the war, they lined up men next to men next to men, like these chairs over here, and they would go running across the battlefield trying to capture the enemy trench, and they would get shot up by the machine guns. Well, now they would start using smarter tactics. They would go usually at night, where nighttime, the darkness would hide the troops, and they would go in smaller groups instead of a bunch of men. They called them stormtroopers on the Germans. They were done by what was called the Hooter tactics, or they called them trench raids. A lot of the times the idea of the trench raid is You'd have a couple men go, rush, get into the German trench, and capture prisoners and get back. That way you would interrogate the prisoners, use torture or whatever, and get information, find out where the Germans are at, where the Germans are planning to attack, how many men are there, what kind of weapons, where do they have the machine guns, things like that. Both sides did this. Well, let's talk about a little problem they have with doing this kind of stuff. If I go in the middle of the night to a German trench to capture a German soldier, and I get caught, and I pull out my gun and shoot, I just made a lot of noise. I just woke up the whole German army. Now they're after me. So they wouldn't use weapons like guns or bombs or anything like that unless they absolutely had to. They'd use quiet weapons. So they'd use knives. They'd use clubs. This got to hand-to-hand combat, kind of like how they had back in the old medieval ages with knights. And you start seeing weapons used in the war that were very, very scary looking, like clubs with giant daggers or nails sticking out of them. Of course, I was telling you guys about the large-scale attacks. Guys running out, lined up. Well, artillery could blow them up. The machine guns could kill them. The rifles could kill them. Due to this caused mass casualties. It got so bad that the Europeans called this the Great War. It even got even worse. They said it was such a killing on an industrial level. They called this war the war to end all war because it was so horribly bad. In addition to that, I talked about the barbed wire. Here's a picture of French soldiers running by the barbed wire. Guys would get caught up and tangled in the barbed wire. Well, if you're tangled, you can't move. They could see you and they could shoot you. New invention used in the war for the first time, airplanes. Now, a little interesting thing about this. The Wright brothers first flew at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina in 1903. World War I broke out in 1914. The airplane was only 11 years old at that time. It's not like a modern day fighter plane or a stealth bomber or something like that. They were very flimsy, easy to break, usually made out of real light wood and canvas and held together by wires. Now, the plane was kind of slow to be used. The French and the Germans were the first to use it. And what they would use it for is to scout. They could fly over the battlefield and look around and see where the enemy was. Well, the problem with that is they're flying around. Here's a French guy flying. There's a German. They run into each other. What are they going to do? They just wave, "Hi, how you doing?" Well, suddenly somebody got smart. We're fighting a war. So they're flying around. There's the German. Here's the French. German waves to the French. French pulls out a pistol and shoots them. Well, okay. Now they're flying around. There's the German. There's the French. That German, remember, the French carried a pistol, so now he's got a rifle, which can shoot further distance and shoot the French. So then they did machine guns. Problem with machine guns is the machine guns would shoot up the plane, especially the propeller. So the Germans decided to develop a new system where they could shoot the machine gun through the propeller blades. And you started to get the age of the dogfights because of this. This is where planes started flying and fighting each other. In addition to using the planes as scouts and fighting each other, they would also fight the ground troops with those machine guns. They could fly over and strafe the trenches, shoot a machine gun at the top of the trench and all the guys in it. They could also fly over the trench and take a hand grenade and drop it down in the trench. Well, hand grenade's pretty effective, but let's get something bigger to kill more of those guys. So let's start dropping bombs. Well, it's kind of hard to fly a plane and drop a bomb together, So let's start designing something to put the bombs under the plane so I could drop the bombs from the plane. That became the birth of the bomber. Now, World War I is real famous with the fighter pilots and the bombers because you started getting heroes out there. Here's two famous ones. This is the World War I aces. What made you an ace is if you shot down 5 enemy planes. Now, the most famous of all the World War I aces was Baron von Richthofen, also known as the Red Baron. He painted his plane bright red. Now, this is him over here at the very end. Now, he had 80 kills, 80 planes that he shot down.
What did you say his name was?
Baron von Richthofen. The gentleman that we have next to here, this is Eddie Rickenbacker. Eddie Rickenbacker was from Columbus, Ohio. He was the leading American ace when the United States got into the war. He had 26 kills. This is his Medal of Honor that he was awarded during the war. You could see Eddie Rickenbacker and his Medal of Honor at the Air Force Museum up at Wright Pat. Now, I talked to you guys a little bit about all these complications. This got into a major problem, all this trench warfare and everything. So, the way to get out of it, the way the guys can get across that land, that no man's land, without getting shot up by machine guns or artillery or rifles, is they started riding in armored vehicles, the tank. Interesting thing, the tank got its name as a secret project. When they started building these, the British were the first to build them. They knew that there were German spies out there looking and seeing what's going on. Well, the Germans, the way to kind of confuse them and make them not think that that's a weapon, is they started labeling these things water tanks. So they made the Germans think that these were big containers to store water in. That way the soldiers can get a drink of water out of them or something. And they started shipping them across the sea, the North Sea, to France. And the Germans, you know, hey, they're bringing a bunch of these water tanks over. You know, it's not a water tank, it's a vehicle. They could load up with machine guns, they can load up with cannons and all that. And now troops can ride inside it and go across the land without getting shot up. In addition, all that barbed wire I talked about, these things can just run right over the barbed wire and you don't have to worry about the soldiers getting tangled up in them. I've got a couple different kinds of tanks. This is a British tank, the German tank. This is a French tank. The Americans used the French tanks in the war. And that's actually American soldiers riding it. All this stuff led to what was called a war of attrition. You know, nobody could get around the other side. Nobody could beat them. So the best way to do this, and the way to win this war, they decided, is to basically make the war as bad and as horrible as it could be for the other guys. The problem is, doing something like that meant that it was going to be just as bad for you. So the generals were kind of out of touch with the general soldier, the infantrymen. They didn't care about the lives of the infantrymen as much. They were away from the front lines and the battles. They stood in fancy hotels and offices and looked at maps and battle reports, and that's all they did. They weren't on the front lines to see how the fighting was. So they'd say, let's send 1,000 men over across no man's land and capture the German trench. Well, 1,000 men would go over and get killed. Well, it's unacceptable. The reason that those guys died wasn't because of our fault, it's because they're lacking bravery. Let's send 1,000 more. That's the way this war happened, constantly. Now, I'm going to talk about a couple battles here, and I'm going to be wrapping up. This is the Battle of Ypres. There's a couple different ways to pronounce the name. Ypres, the British called it Wipers, with a W. This is a town in Belgium. This is up towards the north. This is where the fighting got really bad. This is in what they call Flanders region, Flanders Field. There were multiple fighting in Ypres. The first Battle of Ypres, the second Battle of Ypres, third, the fourth. The second Battle of Ypres was the famous one for the use of poison gas for the first time. This is Gallipoli. Gallipoli was not in Europe. It was actually in the Middle East, in Turkey. This was an Allied plan. It was actually brought up by Winston Churchill, who was the First Lord of the Admiralty of the Navy for the British Empire. The idea was all this fighting going on in Europe was getting bad. Well, the best way to do this is get the Russians to help us out a little bit quicker. Russia had a huge army, but didn't have enough supplies and equipment for their soldiers. So the British were like, okay, we'll send supplies and equipment to you guys to help you if you guys will get in the war quicker. Well, the way we have to do this is we have to go through the Mediterranean Sea and then through Turkey into the Black Sea to Russia. Well, Turkey was an ally with the Germans. They're not going to let the British just go right through. So the British had to conduct a landing, an amphibious landing, to kind of fight the Turks to get supplies to the Russians. Think of this kind of like D-Day in World War II. This is World War I's version of D-Day. The problem was the Turks were being helped a lot by the Germans, and the Turks were up on the high land in the mountains overlooking the oceans. So when the British and the British forces, they used a lot of Anzacs, that's Australian and New Zealand forces, landing. The Turks could just shoot them down at the beaches, and they kept them on the beach. They never got away. This fighting lasted for months and eventually was a failure, and they had to pull out. So they never got supplies to Russia this way. Verdun. Verdun is a city in France. Now, this is probably one of, if not the most famous battles of World War I. Verdun had no military importance. It was a city of national pride. Now, the Germans reckoned because it was a city of national pride, the French would defend it with everything they had. So they decided to attack Verdun, pulling the French out. And they were going to kill as many French as they could. The way they termed it is they were going to bleed France white and make it so bad that the French would give up. Problem is, the Germans suffered just as many casualties as the French did. This battle lasted for about 11 months in 1916. And at the end, this battle alone resulted in almost 1 million people killed. Jutland was the only major naval battle that happened in World War I. This was between the British and the Germans. Germany wanted to rival Britain's naval power, so they came out to fight. Now, the British suffered heavy casualties, more than the Germans, but the Germans ran away from the fight first. And they never fought another naval battle again. They kind of got too scared. The Somme. The Somme is probably the second most famous battle next to Verdun. This was a British planned attack, and this was actually supposed to help relieve the fighting in Verdun. Now, the way the battle started is, it started for a 3-day bombardment of artillery. They fired artillery shells at the Germans for 3 days, non-stop. Fired over 1 million rounds of artillery. They were hoping that the artillery would blow up all the barbed wire so that the troops could walk right on over into the German lines without any problems. On July 1st, 1916, the British went out of their trenches and started walking, not running, just walking across the battlefield to the German side. When the artillery stopped, the Germans knew that the British were coming, so they started manning machine gun positions, like the machine gun back there. And they started shooting these British soldiers walking. In the first hour of the battle, 20,000 British soldiers were killed. By the end of the whole battle, which lasted for months, over 60,000 British soldiers were killed. The Germans alone on their side suffered over 600,000 casualties. That's the same amount of both Union and Confederate soldiers of the American Civil War for the entire 4 years of the war. This happened in a matter of months. This is probably one of the worst battles of the war. Massena Ridge. Okay, I talked about the underground mining. The plan with this was they dug those tunnels under the German trenches and set 21 mines under the Germans. And they detonated all of them at once. 2 of them didn't go off for whatever reason, only 19 did. This was the largest man-made explosion in the world outside of a nuclear bomb. They estimated over 10,000 Germans died within a second when the bombs went off. And it resulted into a massive fight, and it turned the whole battlefield into nothing but a mud pit. Well, that mud pit led to Passchendaele, the Third Battle of Ypres, where again the soldiers trying to cross the land, well, the land's no longer dry, it's all muddy, so the soldiers would get stuck in the mud. And you got some really famous stories that came out of Passchendaele. One in particular is called the Crucified Soldier. Cambrai. Cambrai was the first battle using tanks that was successful. This was the first time the British were able to get around the Germans using tanks. Once they got around, they stopped. They didn't know what to go or what to do afterwards. And the Germans were able to counterattack and put them back. But this is kind of the beginning of the end right here. This war lasted for about 4 years, from 1914 to 1918, and most Europeans felt, will this war ever end? Like I said, they called it such a horrible war. It was the war to end all wars. Now, I'm going to wrap up today. I'm going to talk a lot more about this conflict and battles and about the Americans coming in the next couple weeks. You know, the United States did not get into the war until the last 18 months of the war. So we were only in it for 18 months out of the 4 years. So the British and the French really felt the hurt before we got there. I've got a couple items out here on the table I brought out to show you guys. You guys can come up and look at them if you want, and I can explain them. A couple of these rifles. This is a Austrian-Hungarian rifle. This is actually a German rifle. This is a German Gewehr 88. This is a British SMLE. This is what the British used. I've got a couple different helmets. This is a British Brodie helmet. This is a German Pickelhaube. They changed these helmets later in the war. I got gas mask, a gas rattle, and a couple different pieces, some bayonets. So that's pretty much what I've got for you guys today. I do got a couple names I want a couple people to look up for, so if you guys, I'll let you guys decide who wants to look up some names.